On October 18, 2011 at 5 p.m., the Muskingum County Sheriff's Office in Ohio received a disturbing 911 call. The voice on the line belonged to a woman in a state of absolute panic. She could barely speak, managing only scattered words about the road and something with large teeth. But when she finally got a full sentence out, the dispatcher instantly felt a chill run down her spine. After all, more calls started coming in from different people and different addresses, but all repeating similar, shocking phrases.
911.
I'm pretty sure, and I just saw a wolf.
Yeah, there's a lion on Mount Perry Road in Grayshaw.
I think I just seen one. It looks like a jaguar or a wolf or something.
Sergeant Steve Blake responded to the call, still unaware that this dispatch would lead to one of the most chilling events ever recorded in the quiet town of Zanesville, Ohio. But, as always, viewer discretion is advised. It was around 5:10 p.m. when Sergeant Steve Blake pulled out of the police station and headed in the direction of Zanesville. But as soon as he crossed into town, something felt deeply wrong. A few cars sat abandoned in the middle of the road, with the doors open and no drivers in sight. Signs on shop windows read, "Closed," and not a single person could be seen outside. It felt like the entire town was hiding from something. However, Blake's destination wasn't downtown, as if the reports were true, and if escaped wild animals were the ones behind this chaos. There was only one place they could have come from: the Muskingum County Animal, a farm that was located just beyond the edge of Zanesville, near Kopchak Road. And if the farm name sounds like a local zoo or a regulated wildlife center, well, actually, it wasn't. The property was privately owned by a 62-year-old man, Terry Thompson, who kept dozens of exotic animals in fenced pens and outdoor cages right near his house. It all started back in 1997, when Thompson bought a weak, sickly cub named Simba at an auction as a gift for his wife. The couple nursed it back to health and eventually decided to keep it. However, Simba was just the beginning. Over the next several years, Thompson began collecting more and more exotic animals. First, monkeys, then wolves, bears, and even full-grown lions and tigers. By 2011, the man had 56 wild animals on his property and a reputation for taking in any exotic creature that nobody else could handle. As the collection grew, Thompson constantly expanded the farm and even built a so-called central corridor of new cages stretching right from the main house to the storage barn. And throughout it all, Thompson had a longtime assistant by his side, 48-year-old John Moore, who shared his passion for exotic animals. But no matter how committed they both were, the conditions on the property raised serious concerns. For years, neighbors had complained about the overwhelming smell coming from the farm. The animals were kept in unsanitary cages, some tied together with makeshift straps. Some didn't even have roofs. Furthermore, several animals looked visibly underfed and had open wounds. But over time, the concern shifted from animal welfare to personal safety. In 2008, several large predators escaped and wandered into nearby neighborhoods, tearing through fences and sending residents into a full-blown panic. And yet, all authorities could do was return the animals to their cages. Because, technically, Terry Thompson wasn't breaking any laws. At the time, the state of Ohio had no meaningful restrictions on private ownership of exotic animals, which eventually led to several more escapes from the farm. So, when Sergeant Blake responded to the call that evening, he was hoping this would be just another repeat, with a few loose animals to bring back to their cages and nothing serious. But as he pulled up to the edge of Thompson's property, it was clear this time would be different. Thompson's farmhand was already standing near the main house, visibly shaken and disturbed. John Moore had just arrived for the evening feeding and had already heard from neighbors that some animals might have gotten loose. So together they knocked on the door and called Terry's name several times, but no one answered. Then they decided to check that same corridor of cages leading toward the barn, and suddenly froze in shock. Almost all the enclosures were wide open, with several lions, tigers, and bears already roaming the area. However, the real shock was waiting just ahead. Near the barn entrance, a 200-kilogram white tiger, surrounded by raw chicken legs with its teeth sunk deep into something. And once they got a closer look, Sergeant Blake and John were truly horrified, because what the tiger was actively eating wasn't chicken. It was a lifeless human body, and none other than Terry Thompson's. The tiger was nearly ripping its keeper apart, with the powerful jaws buried deep into his head and neck. Sergeant Blake immediately called for backup, But trying to investigate everything properly was too dangerous and no longer the priority, since now it was clear that the lives of everyone in Muskingum County were in immediate danger. By around 5:45 p.m., reinforcements had arrived and were quickly deployed across designated zones surrounding the Kopchak Road area. One group of officers was assigned to patrol the perimeter, preventing any animals from escaping the property. Another group was sent door to door to alert local residents, instructing them to stay indoors, lock all windows and doors, and seek shelter if necessary. Despite the growing police presence, the outside was still dangerously unpredictable. At the same time, planning the operation to capture the animals was entrusted to Muskingum County Sheriff Matt Lutz, with nearly 33 years of law enforcement experience. At first, he instructed officers to lure the predators back into their cages using food, but the animals were far too frightened and disoriented. So unfortunately, the plan didn't work. Next, they tried tranquilizer darts, successfully sedating a few animals that hadn't left their enclosures. However, when it came to the larger predators still roaming freely across the property, officers ran into their first major challenge. The Muskingum County team had only a limited number of tranquilizer rifles and even fewer doses of the necessary sedatives. Tranquilizers don't work instantly and typically require from 5 to 15 minutes to take effect, and that delay can be even longer depending on the animal's size, stress, or adrenaline levels. Therefore, already agitated lions, tigers, and bears apparently required multiple doses that the police officers simply didn't have. Veterinarians from the Columbus Zoo promised to deliver more sedatives, but daylight was fading, and not a single large animal had been captured yet. So, there was no time to wait. If even a few predators broke through and reached Interstate 70, they'd have a direct path to Columbus, the 15th most populous city in the United States, with over 913,000 residents. Sheriff Lutz knew the risk and was preparing to make a fateful decision. But before giving the order, officers made one last attempt. Once they spotted a full-grown tiger in the open, they fired a single tranquilizer dart straight at it. But instead of backing off, the tiger snapped and charged directly at the officer at full speed. And in that very moment, a shot suddenly rang out. Within just a few hours, horrifying photos of dead animals scattered across the farm began circulating online and hit the news. From a monkey mauled by other predators to wolves, bears, and African lions, their bodies lay in piles, soaked in blood, most with visible gunshot wounds. Among the dead were several Bengal tigers, a species that, both then and now, remains critically endangered. In 2011, the global population of Bengal tigers was estimated at only 2,900 individuals, and in just one night, 18 of them were brutally shot and killed on a single notorious farm in Ohio. I don't want to go into every detail because what happened to the remaining animals is just hard to process. Yet, all I can say is that the constant shooting lasted for a shocking 13 hours. And by that point, there were nearly 50 law enforcement officers on site, all armed with handguns, assault rifles, and even submachine guns. But for one person, the tragedy wasn't just something to read about or see in the news, since he witnessed it unfold in real time. And that man was John Moore, who had spent over 15 years with those animals while working on the farm. I cried like a baby. It was the worst thing. I loved those animals. I bathed them, fed them, played with them, and took care of them. The man desperately tried to intervene. He pleaded with officers, insisting he could at least rescue the wolves he used to play fetch with. However, just minutes later, one of those very wolves was hit by a car and instantly killed after fleeing in a panic from the sound of constant gunfire. I watched the animals getting shot from the gate. I told Chief Deputy Jeff LeCoq that I could get them back in their cages, but they looked at me like I was stupid. Yet the only help the officers accepted from Moore was a handwritten list of every escaped animal he knew by name. And unfortunately, by sunrise, that same list had become a death record, with 50 out of 56 animals eventually killed. Once police completed a final sweep of the property and nearby roads, confirming that the danger had passed, residents slowly began stepping out of their homes. Still visibly shaken, they immediately began firing off officers with a wave of truly uncomfortable questions, like how something this catastrophic could have been allowed to happen. Yes, the neighbors had seen the escapes from the farm before, but never anything close to a disaster on this scale. Yet the answers began to surface only after the area surrounding Terry Thompson's body was declared secure, once the nearby white tiger was fatally shot, along with the others. When forensic investigators were finally able to examine the body more closely, they saw something no one expected. a clearly visible bullet wound right in the center of his head. And with that shocking discovery came a new haunting question. What really happened that day? Terry Thompson wasn't just known as the man with the largest private collection of exotic animals in the country. He was also seen by many as, well, quite an eccentric figure. From 1969 to 1970, Thompson served in the Vietnam War, working as a helicopter mechanic and possibly as a door gunner with the 155th Assault Helicopter Company at Camp Coriel near the Cambodian border. And as many who knew him well later said, whatever he saw there entirely changed him. They believed Thompson returned home with PTSD, something he never fully recovered from. But Thompson's struggles didn't end there. Just 3 weeks before the tragic incident, he had been released from federal prison, where he had served a 1-year sentence for illegal firearms possession. And the man was now facing house arrest, set to begin in just a few days. On top of that, his personal life was also nearly falling apart. He suspected his wife of having an affair and was facing serious financial pressure due to unpaid taxes and mounting debt. However, in the final week leading up to the tragedy, Thompson had grown especially withdrawn. He was deeply anxious about the state of his farm and feared he would no longer be capable of caring for the animals. The man truly believed the one thing still giving him a sense of purpose, his farm, was about to be taken away, and to him, that meant losing everything. But on the night before the tragedy, around 9 p.m. on October 17th, during what would become his final conversation with John Moore, Thompson made a chilling remark. The man said he had a plan, and then he added, "You'll know when it happens." On the morning of October 18th, 2011, Terry Thompson left the main house with a clear sense of resolve. But instead of heading out for his usual morning feeding, he walked directly toward the cages. One by one, he began cutting open and destroying them, releasing nearly every wild creature on the property. And then came the most horrifying part. Thompson scattered raw chicken legs around his feet, possibly to draw the animals toward him, pulled out a handgun, and did the unthinkable. It's almost unbearable to think about. A man who spent the final days of his life terrified of losing his animals ended up sealing their fate nearly with his own hands. And eventually, John Moore would bury dozens of their bodies on that very farm with tears in his eyes. However, amid the devastation, there was at least one tiny piece of good news. 6 animals made it out alive. 3 leopards, 1 small grizzly bear, and 2 Celebes crested macaques had all been successfully tranquilized during the operation and then transported to the Columbus Zoo and Aquarium. Unfortunately, one of the leopards, named Anton, was later euthanized after a tragic accident in which a cage door slammed onto his neck. The remaining 5, however, became the focus of a legal battle. Marion Thompson, Terry's widow, fought hard to get them back, and after a year-long court case, she eventually succeeded. In September 2012, the animals were returned to her custody once she met all state requirements for care and housing. It's hard not to be disturbed by the related laws that existed at the time, or rather, the lack of them. But in the years that followed, things finally began to change. By 2014, the state of Ohio had passed some of the strictest exotic animal regulations in the country. Ownership of big cats, bears, wolves, or primates was now banned, unless the owner complied with a long list of legal requirements. Furthermore, keepers were required to register every animal, pay steep licensing fees, pass background checks, carry liability insurance, and submit to routine inspections. The state even built a 20,000 square foot holding facility in Reynoldsburg, designed specifically to house exotic animals seized from their negligent or non-compliant owners. Shortly after the October 2011 tragedy, Terry Thompson's farm was permanently closed, and within just a few years, the property became completely overgrown and abandoned. Most people eventually forgot that exotic animals had ever lived there, but what they didn't forget was the image of dozens of wild animals lying dead in the mud as a result of a massive and highly controversial police shooting. For years, the deputies involved in the operation were harassed, bullied, and publicly vilified by animal rights activists and members of the public. They received hate mail, threatening phone calls, and were called murderers both online and even in person. However, for the officers, the worst part wasn't the backlash, but living with what they had to do and carrying that guilt for the rest of their lives. Esquire reporter Chris Jones later recalled what one deputy quietly admitted to him. "I want people to know this wasn't fun. Nobody was laughing. Nobody was having a good time. It was a really long, hard, rainy, dangerous night." Still, at press conference, the officers found themselves having to justify their actions again and again. Sheriff Matt Lutz consistently emphasized that his top priority was public safety and that the decision he made during the operation, while drastic, was necessary given the extreme circumstances. And the truth is, no matter how horrific it sounds, that night, according to protocol, the officers were indeed acting within the full scope of their duty to protect the public, even if that duty demanded something truly unthinkable. But what do you think? Was the existing threat enough to justify the brutal shooting of 48 exotic animals that had already spent years suffering in cages they never chose? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe for more shocking real-life stories, because sometimes the worst consequences come not from wild animals, but from a single life-altering decision.